notice for supporters of Always Take Notes. We are overhauling our offering on the crowdfunding site Patreon.
Our central offer for those who support the show is a sheaf of successful journalistic pitches, which we've solicited from friends of Always Take Notes. Now greatly expanded, the package runs to more than 100 pages.
For those who may not know, a pitch is the document, generally sent by email, that lays out the idea for an article. And we've assembled a huge collection of battle-tested examples that all worked in the real world. Every one of them led to an article getting commissioned.
In the package, we now have successful pitches to, among others, The New York Times, The Guardian, The New Yorker, The Financial Times, The Economist, The London Review of Books, Vanity Fair, Outside Magazine, The Spectator, The Sunday Times, Esquire, Granta, The Literary Review, Bloomberg Businessweek, and GQ.
Anyone who supports the show with $5 a month or more will receive the full compendium.
For those who contribute $10 per month, we'll also add a signed copy of our new podcast book, which is filled with more real-world advice from past guests on Always Take Notes.
Those who pay $15 a month can join a monthly call with Simon and myself to discuss any aspect of their writing lives.
We're keen for the pitch compendium to be a living and constantly growing document. So if any listeners have successful pitches of their own they'd like to include, do get in touch with us through the podcast website. In every case, we redact the editor's name and email address, so no one is breaking confidences by contributing.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we speak to the journalist and author, Michael Lewis.
We spoke to Michael about moving from finance to writing with his debut Liar's Poker in the 1980s, about his subsequent books, including Moneyball, The Blind Side, and The Big Short, and about his latest book, Going Infinite, on the rise and fall of Sam Bankman-Fried.
It's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it.
Michael, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here. We wanted to start with Going Infinite, your new book, and particularly how you first came across Sam Bankman-Fried. You mentioned in the text that you got a call from a friend of yours who was actually trying to suss him out, possibly to make an investment with him. And we saw elsewhere that this was Brad, I think I'm pronouncing the name correctly, Katsuwama, who you knew from Flash Boys. But take us to that moment, and when you first entered Sam Bankman-Fried's world and thought at that stage this was maybe not for reporting, but rather for a different aim, as it were.
Well, so it was where I'm sitting now. I'm in my office in Berkeley, California, and he came and knocked on my door. He rolled out of an Uber in his shorts and his rumply socks and T-shirt, and I took him on a long walk. And I didn't know who he was. I never heard of FTX. I had resisted entreaties from crypto people over the last decade to write a book about crypto. I just had no native interest in it. It was like I was doing a favor for a friend. Like, just tell me what you think of this guy, was what he asked me. And after I had maybe a couple hours with him, and it was a combination of his strange manner, his strange situation. Forbes had just said he said he was the richest person in the world under 30, and he had $22 billion at his fingertips. And how interesting it was to talk to. That unlike virtually any other crypto person I had met, he wasn't trying to sell me crypto. He was a little bit cynical about crypto and described it and explained it in ways that just hadn't ever been explained to me. And so I got interested. I mean, what gets my socks going up and down in the very beginning with a subject is if I feel I'm learning things, and I'm interested in what I'm learning. And then there was this whole other dimension that it was pretty clear that, like, the point wasn't to become a rich person. The point was to become a rich person to affect the world in all kinds of ways. And he was mucking around in American politics. He was Biden's first or second or third biggest donor. Mitch McConnell was about to use him to meddle in the Republican Senate primaries. He was talking to Trump about paying him not to run for president. All this kind of comes out in my first encounter or two with him. And so I said to him, like, this is interesting enough. I just kind of want to watch. Can I come down to the Bahamas where you're based and just talk to people? And so that's what I did. And I do this, it didn't mean I was going to write about him. It meant I was thinking about writing about him. I didn't have a plan. I had the concept of a plan, as Trump might say. After a few weeks interviewing the people who work there, all those people who end up testifying against him, plus a lot of others, and his investors, and the Bahamas regulators, and the sordid rich people who were interested, and people who hate him, it became clear that there was at least the beginning of a story. And so I just kept going back. and this will take us to the end of the story too quickly, but I spent a year doing this without knowing for sure that I had a book. And it took me, it was a conversation days before FTX blew up with a friend who's a film director, that he put his finger on what my problem was. I told him, I described Sam Bankman-Fried to him, this weird kind of maybe autistic person who had grown up totally isolated, had no friends. Now he was the richest person in the world under 30 and everybody wanted to be his friend. He seemed to be shaping the world in all kinds of ways. What was going on in the crypto markets was interesting. I told my friend kind of the outlines of the story. And I said, but I don't know if I can write it. I can't figure out what it is that I've got. And he says, your problem is you don't have a third act. He said, there's no movie here because there's no ending. And I said, that I don't care about the movie. I'm not writing a movie. I'm writing a book. But it's a problem for the book that it didn't have a shape. I didn't really know what to do with the material. And then like 2 days later, FTX just blows up. My director friend emails me and says, I want to direct the movie. And all of a sudden there was a story, beginning, middle, and end. So not until it all went bad did I know how to write it. But before it all went bad, I felt like I just was learning a lot of stuff. Just one example. One of the things that intrigued me right off the bat with him was he had spent 3 years at Jane Street. And Jane Street is one of the handful of Wall Street firms that now dominates financial trading in the world, making more money than Wall Street firms have ever made. And they're totally opaque. Like you can't get in to see them. They won't give you interviews. And I could tell from the way he talked about it and from the number of people from Jane Street he had hired that I was going to be able to get a Jane Street story out of this. That he was going to be able to allow me to go places that without him I couldn't go.
I was interested reading the book in that you describe him as very reluctant to show emotion or incapable of showing emotion. What challenges did that pose to you as a writer?
It wasn't just emotion. It was any kind of empathy is maybe not the right word, though he would say he lacked it. He completely lacks empathy. It was an inability to connect, like make a real connection with me. One of the ways that I usually I get to know a person well enough to write about them, and it's usually a very long process, is I let them know some things about me. I have to open up a bit about me and what I'm doing in order for them to want to open up about themselves. This was an entirely one-way relationship in that he, for whatever reason, mostly opened up to me without ever wanting to know a single thing about me. I mean, I still talk to him. I talked to him 3 days ago in jail. He's never asked me a single question about anything. I don't know if he knows I have a wife and children. I don't know if he knows what books I've written. I don't know if he knows where I grew up. I don't know if he knows if I have a stomach ache. It's like he's never asked a single question. And so that didn't kind of exactly get in the way, but it took me a while to figure out that I didn't need to do that with him in order to get what I needed from him, and that I didn't need to have that relationship, that it was going to be a different kind of thing. His lack of maybe more to your question, his lack of a normal emotional infrastructure, it just presented challenges how I wrote him. Because there's a way that if you write that in one way, he seems like a sociopath. It's like it's his fault he doesn't have emotion. It's his fault he doesn't feel empathy. But in his presence, and this isn't just me talking, this is like everybody who works with him, there's a kind of pity you feel for him that he has to go through life without this. It's like someone going through life with some kind of disability. And it presents itself that way. And so when writing him, I wanted to be careful not to let the reader just easily hate him for this absence in him, because he was born with it. It's like there's nothing he could really have done about it. And to the extent there was something he could do about it, it was to acknowledge it, put his finger on it and say, this is something about me I have to watch. And he'd done that.
I was interested, Michael, as well, in your decision to not embark on a kind of long, detailed discussion of what crypto was in the book. And you had this quite kind of neat footnote saying that's it for crypto explanation at the moment, as that's all that Sam Bankman-Fried knew about crypto, or for that matter needed to know to trade billions of dollars worth of it. Plus so many writers have taken a crack at explaining to a lay audience what a Bitcoin is that it's hard to see the point of doing it all over again. And you actually attribute a couple of other writers and mention a particular Business Week story. What was the decision making behind not doing that explainer piece?
That is such a good question, and nobody's asked me that question. And I've done a lot of these interviews, so congratulations. It's because it was obviously a decision. I was turning to the reader and saying, look, this isn't a crypto book. And it's not a crypto book because crypto was just Sam Bankman-Fried's excuse. He didn't care about crypto. And I'm writing about him. And since none of these people cared about crypto, and they all thought it could go to zero at any moment, and they didn't have this religion, they faked it sometimes for the crypto people. So it was like, why do I have to engage the reader about crypto if the subjects aren't engaged with crypto? There is this other thing that it really has been explained. The blockchain has been explained so many times in so many different ways that anybody who really wants to know knows already. And I have found that people with crypto, it's not just crypto. I would also say this applies to a lot of complicated financial instruments like collateralized debt obligations. You sit down with a piece of paper and pencil and you explain it to someone and they get it and they go away. And a day later, they've forgotten it. And it's just like, I thought I knew, but what I had in my mind were these fleece clouds. And it's so unsatisfying, and the reader didn't need it. And so much to me of storytelling is figuring out what the reader needs and what the reader doesn't need. And there is art in deciding what the reader doesn't need as well as in what the reader does need. What you leave out is almost more important than what you put in. And some extended treatise on crypto, I'm aware that some people thought I had an obligation to do that, but I didn't think I did because I didn't think it was relevant to the characters or their journey. So I made that decision. Not that I didn't go to bother to find out what crypto was myself. It just all ended up on the cutting room floor.
I was going to say, I saw in your acknowledgements that you credit Will Bennett and Christina Ferguson to explaining and researching crypto for you. So is it something that you felt that you needed to understand in order to write about it properly, but
sure.
without, going into the detail?
There are a gazillion things in any story that I need to know that the reader doesn't need to know that I did the work or that I understood this thing. Of course, I had to understand it. You have to understand to know it's not important. I know that's an odd way of putting it. It's not important to the story. There are things about crypto that were important to the story. The technology wasn't all that important to the story, but the social origins of it, that was started out as a expression of mistrust of the financial system and of fiat currency. It was a reaction to the financial crisis and an anger towards Wall Street and the city. That though it was premised on a kind of cynicism and a mistrust, that it quickly developed a financial system around it that required all the same trust that the old financial system did. The reader needed to understand those things because trust is at the center of the story. And Sam Bankman-Fried's abuse of it is an important part of it, his ability to earn it and then lose it. So there are aspects of crypto that are important. It's just like we did not need 5 pages on the blockchain. Yeah, and I have a feeling that the readers who kind of most enjoyed the book were really grateful that I just said to them, it's okay. It's okay. What you need, you'll know what you need to know to understand what happened. But this isn't going to be a class on what the blockchain is. I did this in The Big Short, and it was a little less heavily handed, but I had these things I had to explain. Credit default swaps, those are pretty easy, but collateralized debt obligations, and I didn't really explain them. I just left the reader feeling they knew all they wanted to know, and it was like, yeah, at some point you got to give up because this isn't like a primer on crypto or on financial engineering.
You've often written about people who are not terribly well known before you write about them. So someone like Billy Beane in Moneyball or Brad Katsuyama. Sam Bankman-Fried, I mean, as I suppose, particularly as FTX blew up, gained this huge international profile. And then in the kind of reaction and the discussion to the book, there's been this big question about I suppose, the role of kind of sympathy or liking your characters in your reporting.
Right.
And this question of whether, you over sympathize with them. And I thought it was very interesting to read the afterword, where you lay out, exactly where your book fitted at first release with the publication timeline, but also you kind of, muse on that a bit. I mean, what has your feeling both about the reaction and the kind of review commentary been about it, and about, where things sit now post conviction, and as you say, you've had a view throughout this whole story.
So it's true that it was really different to have a character who people knew something about. That normally I'm coming out with a book and people are just oblivious to the main character. And so it's really useful because they come with no preconceptions. And in this case, it was obnoxious that people had lots of preconceptions based on pretty sketchy information. And then I was in a position where, but on the other hand, it's kind of fun to be in the position of actually knowing not just him, but all these people and their situation better than anybody, because I had, sheerly by accident, ended up sort of marinating in the place for a year before it blew up. And hadn't done the usual journalistic thing of going in for 45 minutes, asking questions across the desk, going back and bashing out a kind of shallow smash and grab piece of journalism. That I really tried to understand it, and him and everyone around him. So I had way superior information than the people who were reacting to what I've written. But the price I pay benefit of him being known is everybody's like interested in him already. The cost is that people have some picture in their head of him that's inadequate, not really true to life, or distorted in all kinds of ways. And I'm coming in with a really carefully drawn portrait, the way a painter would draw someone's portrait, where I've gone back over and over and over again to make sure I get it right. And I guess it isn't surprising that people, not everybody, but that some people thought that my portrait made him look better than the picture they had in their heads based on really cursory information delivered in, through Twitter or brief newspaper articles. I mean, it would be surprising if the portrait wasn't different. And then it would be surprising if it just kind of like amplified whatever prejudices they had going into the story. But it does mean that the book has to run a little bit of a gauntlet. And where I would have been disturbed, like really disturbed by the response, is if people who were similarly positioned to me, there weren't any journalists, but people who worked with him, for example, people who really knew him from a long time ago, people who'd watched him over long periods of time, which included all the people who were most furious with him, because the people who were most damaged by him were his employees. Not only did they lose all their money on the exchange, but they lost their jobs and their reputations. I mean, it's not like they were biased in his favor. If those people had said, yeah, you got him wrong. Oh, it was too sympathetic. Oh, I don't know the guy you wrote. That would have been a problem. But nobody said that. And I have had 20 people reach out to me and say, you nailed him. And I'll give you one example that will also enable me to do something else here. So a lot of people made a judgment about how I was drawing him based on the beginning of the book. He becomes progressively less sympathetic as the book goes on. And so the fact that a reader is able possibly to like him or empathize with him in the beginning of the book bothered a lot of people who wanted to hate him right off the bat. Towards the end of the book, there's a character who absolutely is just furious beyond belief with him, Zane Tackett, who is, I think, kind of in a weird way, the moral center of the book. He's sort of old, true believer of crypto who works for Sam. And Zane ripped him a new asshole every which way in the book. Like Zane, who you trust when you're reading his account, leaves you hating Sam. And Zane has reached out and said, you completely nailed him. Like everything that's both bewitching and appealing and infuriating about him, you got it. So I don't think I got him wrong. I think the world wishes I got him wrong. And I can't do much about that, except time cures it. You just watch. If you have me back on your podcast, assuming it still exists in 5 years' time, the verdict on this will be completely different, and the world will drift to like who this guy actually is, as opposed to who they wish he would be.
I wondered about the status of your book as a legal document, or the way that the prosecutors and the defense kind of wanted to bring it into the trial. Could you talk a little bit about that? So
the prosecutors, they didn't subpoena it. They didn't force me to hand it over, but they called the publisher. The trial was started in October of 2023. Kind of early August, they got in touch, assuming I was like most authors, and that like it must have been in the can for months. I have a deal with my publisher that they turn it around in about 4 weeks. So they didn't even have the book. They had parts of it, and so they could say honestly that we don't have the whole book. And the prosecutors then went away. The defense tried to introduce a passage or two, and the judge wouldn't allow it. And I don't know why the judge wouldn't allow it. I can't remember. I can't remember what he said. It was it was in a private conference with the judge where he wouldn't allow it. So the book, in that sense, never found its way in the courtroom. It didn't find its way into the. Once or twice it was mentioned by people on the witness stand. But what was really funny to me is I went to watch the trial. Not all of it. I was on book tour. But I watched Sam. I went to go watch Sam testify. And then I also watched the sentencing. And the book was physically all over the courtroom. I signed 30 copies the first day I was there. So it was like everybody was reading it along with the trial, almost like a libretto. And so it had that kind of weird relationship to it. I felt personally uncomfortable with both prosecution and defense wanting to make use of it, because they're just making what are they going to do? They're going to distort it for their purposes. And that's their job, is to get up and distort reality in one direction or the other. Their job is not to get up and tell the truth. And I didn't like the idea of it kind of being tainted by their process. So I was happy that nobody got their claws on it, or nobody were able to really use it for their purposes during the trial.
We wanted to come back to Going Infinite in due course, but could we roll back now to the beginning of your career? So you grew up in New Orleans and you studied history of art at Princeton. And we found this quite a nice comment. You talked about writing your senior thesis there for an archaeologist called William Childs, and that you handed it in and asked, what his view on the writing was, and he said something like, don't make a job of it, or don't do that. Take us back to.
He said, he said, put it this way: don't try to make a living at it.
Okay. Take us back to that, that period of your life, and what you wanted to do, and then how you ended up going the way you went.
So I'm not one of these people who, when I was a little boy, sat in my room making up stories, imagined myself as a writer, had writers who were my heroes, worked for the school newspaper. None of that. I can't remember an English teacher ever saying that I wrote well. In fact, I remember some bad grades in English class. I've had an odd journey as a writer. I got to my senior year at Princeton, and Princeton has an unusual requirement of all its students that they're not able to graduate unless they write a thesis. And the thesis is not a trivial thing. People go to their graves still having nightmares about being late with their theses or forgetting their thesis topic or whatever. It's a book. You have to write a book your senior year in college. It's 60,000 words. And I dove into how Donatello used classical sources. There was some new information about when things had been dug up from ancient Rome and what Donatello might have known and what he didn't know. And you could see how he referenced some of these things in his work. And so I felt I was doing something original because I had new data, and I could look at things in a new way because of the new data. And I got so immersed in it. It was just a transporting experience, having that kind of, it was unlike any other experience in my education. And I came out of it thinking, I want to do this for the rest of my life. I loved doing this. And I got very high marks. It was odd. I got very high marks for the thinking. And I never thought of myself as a particularly adept thinker. I didn't frame myself as an intellectual when I was young. But the writing got criticized. And so I thought, I thought what I was hearing is that I'm supposed to be an art historian. And the same man who said, don't try to make a living as a writer, he said, really don't try to make a living as an art historian. It wasn't, this wasn't a commentary on me. He said, there's not going to be art history. The profession was already falling apart. There'll be no jobs. So I went off. I thought, well, I think this means I want to be a writer. I want to write books. And this is in the context of me, it's a bizarre ambition. No one would have thought. No one who ever knew me at any time in my life would have ever thought that this was what I would do. But I set off quixotically when I get out of college to try to get magazine pieces published. And I like write random things. I go have random experiences and I write random things about them. I go ladle soup for homeless people in the Bowery Mission and Young Men's Home in Lower Manhattan. And I write a long piece about homeless people. No one wants to publish it. There are lots of those kind of experiences until finally The Economist publishes something I write. And I get my start in England. I'm a graduate school at the London School of Economics, and first The Economist, and then some other publications there start to just publish me. And it starts to become real. And people start telling me weird things like, you have a voice. Like, what's that? Okay, great. I'm glad I have it, whatever it is. But it's still kind of there's no clear path to making a living doing this. I'm making 90 pounds a piece writing for The Economist. And so I get a job, kind of luckily, on Wall Street coming out of graduate school. And pretty quickly it becomes clear that the things that I'm watching and the experience I'm having have the dimensions of a long narrative, and that I could write a book about it. And I start writing articles about it, and they get a lot of attention, which leads to an agent wanting to represent me, which leads to me submitting a proposal to write a book about Wall Street, which leads to Liar's Poker. In the history of book creation, there can be very few people who sat down to write a book with as little experience and as little justifiable hope as I had when I sat down to write Liar's Poker. I was learning by doing.
We also saw that you told your father that you were going to quit working on Wall Street to write Liar's Poker, and he kind of gave a long pause at the end of the phone and told you to think twice about it. Was there any moments that you yourself doubted whether you could do it, or did you just kind of have an ambition and you wanted to see it through?
God, it's great being 26 years old. I didn't have any doubt. Like zero. I don't know why I didn't have any doubt. You look back on it, it's insane what I did. It was so my father, who never tells me to do anything. He's still alive. He's great. He still doesn't tell me to do anything. He was so shocked that this Wall Street firm had just paid me $250,000 or whatever they paid me. It seemed like an unlimited sum of money, and said they were going to pay me double the next year and all that. That he said, like, wait, you're going to leave? You can't. He said, like, you can't do that. Don't do that. This is just crazy. He says, wait 10 years and then write your novels. So my thought was, you're not seeing what I see. That I see people who are 10 years older than me here, and no way could they ever leave now. They're just trapped by the money. And so I ignored his advice. But this is how crazy it was. The people who ran the firm brought me into a room in London, above Victoria Station, which is where the offices were, to talk to me before I walked out of the door. They knew I was going to go write a book about Wall Street. They didn't care about that. That wasn't like, whatever, go have at it was their attitude. They were really worried about my sanity. They thought I was screwing up my life. It was sweet of them. They're like, don't leave. Like, this is like, you're in a magical place at a magical time, and we're going to pay you magical sums of money. Why would you do this? They were worried about me, and I felt elation. I was bored with the job. It was the same thing over and over. The first couple of years was really exciting, and then it got boring. I was just filled with this feeling that I was meant to write. And it just didn't occur to me to worry ever. I mean, I worry more now about decisions I make than I worried then. So it really is. It's like the testosterone. Young male testosterone is like the most dangerous chemical in the world. But sometimes it works out. Sometimes it's a superpower, and in that case, it was a superpower.
As long-time listeners of the show will know, we published Always Take Notes, advice from some of the world's greatest writers, in 2023. We're pleased to say that we have now put together a new and updated edition of the book, which now features contributions from more than 100 past guests on the podcast.
The book, which is available now, is the distillation of the wit and wisdom we've heard over the past 7 years. It offers frank and entertaining guidance on writing in particular and living a creative life in general. It answers questions such as, where do the best ideas come from? How do you stay motivated? What does it take to become a published author? And how do you actually make money from your writing?
Alongside all the great guests we quoted in the first edition, the update includes new material from Harlan Coben, Victoria Hislop, Lee Child, Megan Nolan, Jhumpa Lahiri, Philippa Gregory, Joe Nesbo, Paul Theroux, Hisham Matar, and Bethany Hughes.
Published by Ithaca Press, the latest edition of Always Take Notes, advice from some of the world's greatest writers, is available from all good bookshops. We hope you enjoy reading it.
So Liar's Poker was a huge hit. It sold 1 million copies. Could you tell us, what combination of factors really made it break out? We know often with a big hit, it's difficult to do that, but also what the process kind of after that was like. Because another theme that often comes up in the podcast is it's very difficult to say in retrospect why a book did so well, but also that following up a big hit can itself be challenging. So take us, back to the experience of the book and then also the experience of what you decided to do afterwards.
So the book, my first book, I didn't have my publisher trained. So they took like 10 months to get it out. So there was this galley that was circulating. And even before it came out, I started to get calls from people I didn't know who like ran magazines, who said, would you write for us, kind of thing. And I thought, this thing is striking a chord with people. Nobody saw how big it was going to be when it came out. The publisher didn't print enough copies and all the rest. It was like the day it came out, though. Things happened like there was like a Barnes and Noble or a Walden Books or something down on Wall Street that had 300 copies that were gone in an hour. It was that kind of thing. Like people were grabbing it like Skittles. And so instantly it was clear that it hit some kind of nerve. And I was getting calls from like the trading floor of Salomon Brothers where people were reading it under their desk. So it just went boom. And that was fun. I remember both my editor and me not being, the publishing house being surprised, but my specific editor, Starling Lawrence, who's still my editor, and me not being surprised, that surprised. And I think I wasn't that surprised because I'd had this crazy reaction to several pieces I'd written while I was at Salomon Brothers about Wall Street. And and at the bottom of it all was this hunger to know what the hell was going on. Like the entire educated class in America was being sucked into Wall Street all of a sudden, like the best brains out of the best schools, and kids were being paid fortunes. And clearly, like all of a sudden, the financial sector was at the center of the universe, and no one had really described it. So I was just in the middle of a phenomenon that people were really curious about, and there weren't any voices coming out. Like there wasn't such a thing as the Wall Street memoir. So it didn't feel, it felt kind of organic to me. The whole thing about going out and being on television and having people recognize it on the street, that did not feel normal. That felt really weird. And I didn't really like that at first. It was just, I was really uncomfortable with promotion. But I had to do it. I had no choice. So it was that. Following up. So it's interesting you say this because after it went, after it went big, after I was clearly not going to have to worry about making a living as a writer anymore. I was very aware that I did not know what I was doing, that I got lucky, and that I just needed some basic training in like journalism. And at the time, the magazine I loved the most was The New Republic. It's like great advice for writers. Write for the magazines you read. and I gobble up the New Republic at the time. It was just fantastic magazine. It only had a circulation of about 100,000 copies, but a bit like the Spectator used to. It kind of sat in the middle of the culture, and everybody, like all the politicians and rich people, and everybody read it. And it punched way above its weight. And I had written for them, and they offered me a job. And I thought, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go work in the New Republic, and I'm going to learn to do different things. Exercise different muscles, write essays. I'd never written an essay, write long book reviews, do reportage for them. And so I did that for 6 years, and it was an education. I was surrounded by some of the best writers in the country, and I really learned a lot. So I basically went to journalism school by doing journalism. And I wasn't all that worked up about like repeating the success of Liar's Poker. I didn't think of myself as a financial writer. I just happened to have been in Wall Street when I wrote my first book, and I could have been anywhere. It could have been about anything. So one of the things the New Republic did is let me write about anything I wanted. So I could show that like I can do the same thing with other subjects that I did with Wall Street. And so I just thought something's going to happen that will lead to a next book. And it was a little bumpy. I mean, it took a while before I found the next subject. And mostly what I was a magazine writer for about a decade. But eventually I kind of started to find book-length subjects and write them as books. And the big moment is when I'm able to show my publisher and the market that it really doesn't matter what the subject is. That what matters is my level of interest in the subject. And that I can go write about baseball and it works. That's the big moment. And so that I'm not sitting there thinking, oh, I need a Wall Street book, or I need a business book, or a finance book. And it just took a while. I had to kind of learn stuff.
Presumably your publishers, though, were quite pleased when you came back and you said you wanted to write, The Big Short or Flash Boys. You were working in an area that was a proven success.
Well, so the next big hit they have with me, I published a couple of collections of magazine pieces, and they'd put them on the bestseller list, but they were minor bestsellers. They weren't real books. I wrote a book about Silicon Valley during the internet bubble called The New Thing. And that went boom. In the same way Liar's Poker went boom. But that was at least business adjacent. So they could see, but then I wrote Moneyball. And Moneyball, when they kind of took a big gulp when they saw that that's what I wanted to write about. But I sold them Moneyball as 2 books. I thought Moneyball, and I said in my little email to them, I said, I'm writing this book. It's going to be called Moneyball. I'm only writing it because I want to write the sequel, which is going to be called Underdogs. And I had this whole thing about what I was going to do after I wrote a book I hadn't written. And so actually, I think they were thinking after Moneyball came out that they were really disappointed I'm not going to write another baseball book because Moneyball went so well. And when I came back to the financial sector after a couple of other books with The Big Short, yeah, it's easier. It's an easy sell, but at that point, their mind is like whatever. That as long as it's interesting, you can do it. I don't think they have, even now, I don't think they have a huge bias towards Wall Street as my subject matter. So we just moved away from that.
It's a rule of the show that we always ask about money and how it interacts with people's writing lives. And we saw that after The Big Short, you moved away from a model of taking advances to the books for your books to a profit share model with the publishers. And we've heard that before with David Baldacci, who we had on the show, who mentioned something similar. I'd be interested to kind of hear about how that works in negotiation, but also as someone who writes about the market and as a financial writer and things like that, what's your view on how the market works for books and how you were able to make that kind of drastic change in the business relationships that you yourself were operating with?
So it was the reporting of The Big Short that caused me to look at my own business relations, because I was just shocked by how bad incentives at Wall Street firms had led to the financial crisis. In brief, effectively, the traders who made all the stupid bets on subprime mortgages were paid to make the stupid bets. There was a trader who lost $10 billion for his investment bank and walked away with $50 million from from the trade for personally. And so I just thought, what are my incentives? And it had always sort of niggled at me that my incentives and my publisher's incentives were not aligned. And this is the problem a lot of all writers have, basically, that you get an advance, which already kind of deadens your financial interest in the book because most advances don't even earn out. But even if they do earn out, you're getting a percentage of the cover price. You get like 15% of the cover price of the book. So your interest is in maximizing revenues. The publisher's interest is in maximizing profits. So the writer will always want more ads, more publicity, more promotion, more attention, will want to spend more money promoting a book than the publisher will. And they're constant fights. Like the writers are always saying, oh, they didn't support my book enough. But that's because their interests aren't aligned. If the writer had a piece of the profits rather than the revenues, the writer would be saying, do I really want to pay $40,000 to the New York Times to run an ad? But if the writer doesn't see the costs, then the writer's furious the ad doesn't run. And I so adore my publisher, and I was worried about my own incentives, that I said, we're going to line up our incentives here. And I'm just going to get a piece of the profits, like you. So I will be party to the conversations where we decide whether to spend $40,000 on an ad in the New York Times, which I'm always arguing we shouldn't do. And sometimes they beat me in the arguments. Sometimes they catch me in a moment of weakness. But they want to spend more money promoting my books than I do. Which is a funny conversation. And the effect, I don't know exactly what effect it has on me when I'm writing the books, that I don't get any money unless someone buys the books. But I think it's basically a positive effect. I don't think it's bad to keep one eye on the audience. One eye on, does anybody want to read this? Is it fun? I think it makes me better. It might not make everybody better, but I think it helps me. And I think it helps me create a more excellent piece of writing. So I can afford to take the risk right now. So I'm not going to starve if the book doesn't sell. So, but I like the risk. I like that risk gets me up, gets me out of bed in the morning. And so that's good. And we don't fight. I mean, if we're having fights, it's weird fights, like don't support my book so much. But it's a really happy relationship. And it's old fashioned. I mean, I think Mark Twain had this kind of relationship with his publishers way back when. I think the writer did own a piece of it and was sort of on the hook along with the publisher. I think there's something healthy.
Tolkien did as well. I think.
Did he?
Yeah. I've heard it as well. I mean, it's really interesting to hear you kind of analyze this as a business arrangement, because when we spoke to David Baldacci about it, he said, like, look, if I had not. He said he came at it from a different way from you, but he was a lawyer and he was just like, look, when a deal goes well, you renegotiate. And he said, if I hadn't done that, I'd have left hundreds of millions of dollars on the table, which is very striking for us because we talked to Lee Child, who's like in Britain, the famously well-paid writer. And he told us, in his best ever year, he earned $30 million or whatever. So, it seemed that the amounts of money that could be recalibrated, could be on the table if you recalibrated, were absolutely vast. But I mean, was that your sense that it does end up as a much better deal for you as well as a more kind of collegiate way of working?
There's no emotion that's more important not to stir up than the financial envy of British journalists. I don't want to tell you how much money I make because that just pisses everybody off. But I think. I don't make that. I don't make $30 million on books. The market for my kind of books is nothing like the market for David Baldacci's books, but I probably make twice as much money, 1.5 times as much money, owning the thing. So, but in the bargain, I'm not like furious that that they own it. I like that I own it. It's more pleasurable. Each dollar I like more than the dollars I got before. So it's just a more fun way to do this. But it isn't I left $50 million on the table, or I would have. No, it's nothing like that. Those kind of numbers.
Fair enough. To change tack slightly, I wanted to ask about your interest in sport. You mentioned Moneyball and The Blind Side. To what extent do you think this is a kind of natural extension of your interest in things like risk, chance, uncertainty, human psychology, all of those subjects?
It's definitely what led me into it. But there's, I think what really got me jazzed about the subject was the misvaluation of people. That you had this environment. I mean, never mind it's sports, right? Never mind but the people have been playing baseball for 150 years and basically the same way. And millions of people watch these people play. There's statistics attached to every move they make. They're evaluated like more carefully than any corporate employee. And that this market was making these huge errors of judgment in the value of players because of how basically expert intuition misled people. I thought, man, that's just saying something about how people get valued. I mean, it's that people just aren't, and that's a subject that has meant a lot to me from the very beginning. At the heart of Liar's Poker is like shock that I'm being valued for doing this thing, which I know has probably negative consequences for the society. It's certainly not positive consequences. It's grotesque. So that's what got me really going. That's what made it a book. It was that Scott Hatterberg, first baseman, thought for his whole life that what he did was misunderstood, but he had never had anybody come along and say, yeah, you've been right all along and keep doing what you're doing. It's valuable. It's quite moving when someone sees the true value in another person.
Your other sport book that made a big impact was The Blind Side, about American football. Could you tell us about how that came about as a project? And then with some of the kind of discussion that's gone on with that recently with the lawsuit that Michael Oher has brought to the against the family, what's your thought on what's going on there?
It's sad what's happened since the movie. The movie is responsible for all the trouble. The book was a kind of much quieter and happier affair. But so again, talk about accident. I was writing a magazine piece about my high school baseball coach, and and the point of it was the effect that a teacher can have on a kid, and how that happened when I was a kid, and how it was getting harder and harder for teachers to do what the coach did. And I just happened to be in Memphis, Tennessee, and I thought, I'm writing this article, and one of my old teammates lives here, Sean Toohey by name, and I hadn't seen him since high school. So I hadn't seen him in 20 years or whatever it was at the time. And I sent him a note saying, I'm coming into town. I'd love to talk to you about Coach Fitz. And he offers to come pick me up at the airport. So when I get into his car, and this is someone I have not seen in 20 years. We went to school from age 5 to age 18. We were good friends when we were like 8 years old. But other than that, we were just teammates on sports teams. And I get in the car, and the first thing he says to me is, "So who writes your books?" And I said, I write my books. And he goes, "You're really good at like going out and selling them on TV and all that. Your marketing's incredible." He says, "But like, who puts the words on the page?" And I said, Sean, I put the words on the page." He goes, "No, you don't. You're a dumb shit just like me who sat in the back of English class and got C's. There's no way you write those books." He couldn't believe that the person he knew had become an author. Now, Sean also, he hadn't read a book since high school. He was proud of that fact. But Sean takes me to his house to ostensibly talk about our coach. And Michael Oher, who is then 6'4.5" and 350 pounds, black kid, is sitting on his sofa studying. And Sean never introduces me to him. We talk for an hour and a half. He drives me to my hotel. On the way out to the hotel, I say, like, "Sean, who was the kid?" And at that point, it was kind of middle of Michael Oher's junior year in high school. And they had taken him in a couple of months before. And he was living with them like a member of the family. And I just started following it, not even thinking I was going to write about it. I mean, it took a lot to get me to write the book. And the reason the book comes about is that there's this parallel thing going on in my life at that time. Because of Moneyball, I was interested in like how this sort of thinking, analytical, data-driven thinking might infect other sports or have an effect on other sports. And I was in conversations with the San Francisco 49ers football team's front office. And our conversation drifted to like how they spread their money across their team, like what position got paid how much. And they got me this historical data on the subject. And there was this strange fact that since football players here became free agents, the person who had been the lowest paid player on the team, this offensive lineman called the left tackle, had become the second highest paid, all because of football strategy and these beliefs about what this character was supposed to do. And he was supposed to protect the quarterback's blind side. He was an insurance policy on your most valuable player. So I'm learning about this and how this happened and what it says about why the evolution of football strategy had led to this thing in this position. When Sean calls me and says this weird thing just happened, famous college coach has just said Michael Oher is a future NFL left tackle. And I started to think, well, there is a narrative here. And the narrative is like all the forces in this kid's life that turned him from the lowest valued human being on the planet. He was homeless on the streets of Memphis and, basically illiterate, had not been in school properly for his whole childhood, to this highly prized human being who was all of a sudden actually doing well in school too. And there were all these forces. One of them was football strategy, but another was having a mother. So I wrote the story in 2006. Everything's fine when the book comes out. In fact, Michael Oher, the main character, kind of the main character of the book, really loves the book. He's like, there's no problems at all. I go back to all my characters after the book comes out, and I say, you tell me if I got anything really wrong. And there was nothing like that. So the movie comes out. The movie takes a long time to come out, but eventually it comes out. And it's the book is not a huge hit. The book does well, but it might be my least selling real book as a hardback. Like it didn't go to number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list. It was a hard sell because nobody knew who these people were. And it was about football strategy, and football people don't buy books or read books. But if they do buy books and read books, they don't want a chick flick embedded in the middle of their football book. And so it was falling between various bar stools. And I remember actually my publisher just trying to figure out how to sell it. And they thought they were going to sell it to the evangelical Christian market because the family were evangelical Christians. And I made the mistake of subtitling the book Evolution of a Game. And because the word evolution appeared on the cover, the Christian booksellers would not stock it in the stores. So it was ham-handed from start to finish. I loved the book. I was really proud of the book as a piece of writing, but it didn't do that well. Then the movie comes out and it's explosive. The movie, it's like the second best selling sports movie ever, highest grossing sports movie ever, hundreds of millions of dollars. And it takes a while. But Michael Oher starts to get upset that he hasn't been paid more money for the movie, and his first time he turns on the family is like, "You stole my movie money," and I know what the movie money is because what I did is I gave them half of the money that I got for the movie, and I know that in fact, nobody stole the movie money. The Hollywood studio kept it, pretended that they weren't profits, all the rest that they do. But it got acrimonious between them. And it's now reached the point where Michael Oher has sued them for money he thinks they took from him. Very clearly they did not. So what happens in the aftermath of this when he makes these charges is almost more interesting than the charges. I have a lot of room in my mind to be sympathetic to Michael Oher. What happened to him for the first 15 years of his life should happen to no one. I don't really blame him for having gratitude problems and for thinking people might be doing bad things to him. But some in the media here really, really wanted to believe that this story was somehow not true, that somehow this white family that took in this poor black kid and helped educate him, got him up to reading at his grade level. I mean, bending over backwards to make sure this kid was actually eligible to play football. Sort of rigging the system for him the way a rich family rigs the system for their own children. That somehow there was something sinister in it. It conflicts with the racial narrative in this country that exists in some places in this country, and bothered a lot of people. The movie bothered a lot of people. The book wasn't big enough to bother a lot of people. So some people seized on this. They're like, oh, it's not true. But there's nothing nobody's come to me and shown me anything in the book that's not true. Michael Oher, 2 years ago, he got in touch and said, let's go on the road and talk about the book, make a lot of money. He's still all in on the book. So I don't know what to make of the response, except the response is kind of dishonest. The honest response is, it's really sad that he feels the way he feels and that he thinks they did this bad thing to him, when anybody who knows anything about the money in the movie business has come out and said, there is no money. Like, nothing was stolen from you. And so where I settle in my mind is sad. I would footnote to this, though, is the way the outside world views human relations in the Deep South is quite different from the way human relations in the Deep South actually occur. And it would not shock me if 5 years from now they're back together and everything's fine with them. There was a lot of love there, real love. And I think Leanne Toohey, especially the mom, is just broken up beyond belief with what's happened.
We could talk about the book and its afterlife, I feel like, for another hour, but we're coming towards the end of our time. So I wanted to ask, given your history in art history, why you've not written about the art market. I know you've written a piece about it and you talk about the Salvador Mundi on your podcast, but do you think there's a book on that particularly opaque market in your future?
Now, I may regret saying this, but when I look at that market, I have trouble caring about anybody in it. It just seems like it's a pretty dirty market. It seems like a market for rich people in which rich people get screwed a bunch of times, and I don't know. I don't feel anything when I look at it. It's not inconceivable I'll find a way into that story, but it's just I've had people try to get me interested in it, but it's rich people who are angry they got screwed by their dealer kind of thing. And like, I don't know, do I care that much about that? Not really.
One other thing we saw was about your willingness to kind of walk away from a project, even after you spent a lot of time doing it, if you feel it's not working. So we saw that I think you had an idea for something about minor league baseball after Moneyball that you spent 3 years doing, and then, you put it to one side. Is that...
Yeah.
Tell us about your, what gets you to that point in a project and when is the right time to walk away?
It's so hard, Dan. It's so painful when it's happened. It's only happened a couple of times, but that was the big one. I did spend 3 years in the minor league system, thinking I was writing my sequel to Moneyball that I had plotted out before I wrote Moneyball, and the problem was the interest of that book that I was imagining was in watching this idea spawned by the Oakland A's develop. Like they were using these players they had drafted that year as kind of lab rats to study and learn more about how to predict the future of young men. And the problem is when I had the idea, it was original. And and Moneyball went boom. And all of a sudden there are a million people writing about sports through the lens of data and analytics, and it's no longer fresh. So while the core material was quite good, the characters, the players were really interesting, the situations were interesting, there wasn't anything the reader was going to learn that they couldn't learn from the newspaper. And so when I feel that, like, why bother? It's like, there are already enough mediocre books out there. I have to at least deceive myself into thinking that what I'm doing is fresh and interesting and adds something to the conversation.
Well, I'm not sure if that's the note to end on, but anyway, we've run out of time. But thank you so much, Michael, for your time, and wishing you all the best with this book and all your projects going forward.
Thank you.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Michael Lewis. His website is michaellewiswrites.com. He's on Facebook at facebook.com/michaellewiswrites, and Going Infinite is published by Penguin. Hello, it's us again. Rachel, what was your takeaway on the interview with Michael?
Well, firstly, I should say that this was a particularly interesting guest for me because my husband works in sport data and Moneyball is basically a sacred text in our house. Funnily enough, he has a kind of Jonah Hill character type role, but he would like to be the Brad Pitt character. And it was interesting as well that Moneyball was so successful that it kind of kiboshed his next idea that sport and data was no longer fresh and interesting to him anymore. Anyway, in general, great insights into how he puts his books together and reports them out, and lots of telling details, which I think is also a kind of hallmark of his style. For instance, the story of his book being all over the courtroom at SBF's trial and signing copies and things like that. So yeah, I think it's an entertaining episode. How about you?
I really enjoyed it. I've been reading his stuff for a long time. I remember when I was a child, I was given a copy of Liar's Poker I had an aunt who was really excellent at picking books, and she gave me it, and I devoured it really at that time. I thought the thing that actually really struck me from our discussion with him was his willingness to abandon projects, to put a huge amount of time in and then walk away. And I think that's probably a function and a luxury of the level of success that he's had.
Yeah.
I thought it was very interesting, like how he followed up Liar's Poker. That question that we always have on the show of, you have a massive hit and then what happens after that. And I also thought, there has been a discussion about the new book Going Infinite is different from the reception of his other ones. And I thought it was interesting to get into that. And as he put it, the difference in writing, he usually writes about people who are not terribly well known, but this was very different because it was someone in the public eye. So a great addition to have to our canon.
Yes, interesting as well that had been included in the paperback version of the book as well. So I think it was good to touch on some of the controversy surrounding Going Infinite.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acomb.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jessica Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. We're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.